Good morning. Before I begin to preach, I would like to add a second reading, which we will return to later in the sermon. It's a contemporary reading, and it wouldn't surprise me if you are familiar, if you've read or seen the first portion of this. The line separating good and evil passes not through states, nor between classes, nor between political parties either, but right through every human heart and through all human hearts. This line shifts. Inside us, it oscillates with the years, and even within hearts overwhelmed by evil, one small bridgehead of good is retained. And even in the best of all hearts, there remains an unuprooted small corner of evil. That's Alexander Solzhenitsyn in the Gulag Archipelago. Well, I would say it worked out pretty well that the calendar already had the children learning about pretzels this morning, because it's kind of hard for me to imagine the appropriate children's sermon to accompany this morning's text. Good morning. Have you ever burned your finger? To tell you the truth, I've been having trouble for several weeks imagining an appropriate adult sermon for this passage. This, my friends, is a difficult passage. In sincerity, it may be one of the hardest parables that we ever approach with an unbiased mind and an open heart, and without reflexively trying to explain it away if we don't like what it says, or use it as a theological brickbat to hit other people on the head with if we do like what it says. Just to briefly list its problems, it talks about hell. It talks about money. It talks about the relationship between hell and money. And it's not particularly the relationship we might wish existed between hell and money. But you know, other than that, it's just a feel-good, grace-filled parable, just like last week's story of the prodigal son. So, let's start with the easy problem, hell. Hear now this parable. There was a beggar who used to sit outside a rich man's house. In a strange coincidence, the beggar and the rich man died the very same day. And before they could even get their bearings, they realized they were standing next to each other in line in front of St. Peter at the pearly gates. St. Peter called them both over at the same time, where they stood awkwardly beside each other. Peter looked each one of them over, looked down in his big old book, looked back up at them, and, well, you get the idea, right? I propose to you that if Jesus were telling this parable today, this is how it would go, because we all just pictured the exact same thing, didn't we? We know what that scene looks like. The floor is made out of puffy clouds. St. Peter is in a white beard and a simple white robe. He's standing behind a lectern with a big book on it. There are gates. Strangely, they're never pearly, but there are always gates back there. I mean, we know what a St. Peter at the Pearly Gates cartoon looks like, right? But that doesn't mean we believe St. Peter has been standing on a cloud at a gate with a book in a long line 24/7 for the last 2,000 years. It's just an image that's in the popular consciousness. Well, that's what Jesus evokes when he describes the rich man in the flaming, hopeless underworld and Lazarus at Abraham's side. This is the standard default picture of the afterlife in the ancient Mediterranean world. Jesus is using visual shorthand to paint a stark, unforgettable picture very quickly. And it works, doesn't it? It is stark, and it is unforgettable. But here is takeaway number one from the story this morning. We are not to come to these verses to learn eternal truths about what happens to good people or bad people or any people after death. Does that make sense? Good. But that doesn't help us with the other problems. Because this can get kind of uncomfortable. And why is that? I think it's because whenever we hear a parable, we try to figure out who we are in the parable, which is often a very good use of a parable. Just remembering last week, we hear the parable of the lost son, the prodigal son. We might think about, am I ungrateful for what I have, or selfish, or self-destructive? Do I hurt the people around me? Or, if one of my loved ones hurt me badly, could I forgive him? Or can I, unlike the older brother, work faithfully and not get mad when others in my family don't hold up their end? That's what we do. Would I stop for the wounded man like the Good Samaritan? Would I come back and say thank you like the leper who was healed? Well, but you see, in this parable, who am I? I'm not the beggar. I'm not Abraham. So I must be the rich man. So what should I do with my money between now and when I die, which, by the way, could be any time? Well, let me suggest something really crazy to you. I don't believe we are in this parable. I don't believe we are any of the characters in the story. We're not Lazarus. We're not the rich man. And by the way, it's an old Christian tradition. It's not universal, but it's very old to call this the parable of Dives and Lazarus. To name the rich man, you may have heard of Dives and Lazarus or Lazarus and Dives. Just a little historical factoid, Dives is simply the Latin word for rich. So somehow it became a proper name after Luke was translated from Greek into Latin. I know you wanted to know that. You're welcome. But we're not Lazarus or Dives, or Abraham. We're not the angels that carried Lazarus to Abraham's side, although that would be awesome. If we want to place ourselves in this story, we need to add some characters. The people who lived in this community and knew, or thought they knew, Dives and Lazarus. You see, I'm not sure this parable is about being rich or poor. I think it's about our assumptions, our presumptions, our prejudices, our stereotypes, and yes, our judgmentalism towards people who are rich or poor. And of course, first it would have been about the assumptions people had about the rich and poor in Jesus' day. And some of those assumptions were complicated, but most of them weren't. You see, way back in the book of Deuteronomy, God made a promise to the people right before they entered the promised land. And it was pretty straightforward. If you will obey my law and be faithful to me, I will bless you. And then God lists the blessings, all of which are physical. You will have abundant harvests. Your livestock will reproduce many offspring. It will rain when you need it to rain. You won't get sick, and I will protect you from foreign armies. So you have it pretty good. But if you disobey me, there will be famines and droughts and failed crops and barren livestock and diseases and invading armies. And Israel agreed to the covenant and said, "We will be your people." So the Jewish people had always been inclined to believe, and I mean theologically, doctrinally believe, that wealth was a sign of God's blessing and faithfulness from the individual. On the other hand, though, the prophets did spend a lot of sermon hours condemning rich people who got rich by cheating their neighbors or who did not take care of the poor around them. But by and large, in Jesus' day, both in the Roman world and in Judaism, the majority view was that wealth was a sign of blessing. And what about the beggar? There's an incident in the Gospel of John where Jesus comes across a man begging, a man who was born blind, and he heals him. But first the disciples ask Jesus a telling question. Who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? In Jesus' day, again, because of Deuteronomy, if you had a disease, if you were handicapped, if you were disabled, and you were destitute and you begged, it was because you had disobeyed God. Or, if you were born with the disability, maybe your parents disobeyed God. So when Jesus tells the story of the rich man and Lazarus, he's doing what he did so many other times. He's saying to his listeners, the things and people that you consider blessed and good or cursed and wrong are not the way God sees it. This beggar is not untouchable. He's not guilty of some terrible sin. Lazarus, by the way, means God has helped. The people in this town wouldn't have touched this beggar, but angels touch him and carry him to Abraham's side. And the rich man, most of the folks in Jesus' audience would have been shocked at his fate. Didn't Jesus believe in Deuteronomy? So what about us? What do we think? Well, first, and this is another reason we're not in this parable, we are in, most of us, and not all of us, but most of us in this room are in an economic situation that did not exist when Jesus told this story. We are economically in a middle class. We are not peasant farmers who wonder if we will eat tomorrow. And we also don't have huge fortunes that will enable our descendants to do whatever they want forever. So we're in an interesting situation. We can create assumptions and presumptions, both upward and downward, about both the rich and the poor. And we do, don't we? And frankly, much of the time when we judge the rich and poor, we believe we are right in doing it. We even believe our judgments are biblical judgments. You know what those prophets said about greed, what the Proverbs say about sloth. But should we? Are we the judges of the rich and the poor? When Jesus told all these stories of inversion, was his point to get us to switch sides? Oh, now that I've heard of the Good Samaritan, I'm to understand that Jewish people are evil. If Jesus hangs out with sinners and prostitutes, I guess I have to quit attending synagogue and go find myself a group of sinners to hang out with. Was Jesus' point that God loves the opposite group of people that we thought? Or was his point that God loves all people? Was his point that we should jump over the invisible wall? Or that there are no walls? Was his point you can still look at a person's station in life, not know a thing about them or their heart, but know whether they are good or bad? Was that his point? Or was it maybe something more like this? The line separating good and evil passes not through states, nor between classes, nor between political parties either, but right through every human heart. Even the heart of Lazarus, even the heart of Dives. Amen.